And like I said, I'm glad you're here with us today. My name is Rich Bacolor. I'm a science consultant with Wayne Risa, and this is my friend and colleague, Heather.
Hi, everyone. Heather Rottermond, assessment and instruction consultant at Wayne Risa. And I love presenting with Rich. He's one of my favorite people.
Oh,
So we're glad that you are with us this afternoon, and we're excited to share some things around how science can actually support literacy and how joyful science experiences are for our children.
absolutely. All right, here is a copy of the slide deck in case you want to follow along, or if you want to go back to any of these resources later, you are welcome to do that using either that tiny URL, which has my mantra, keep teaching science. All right, so we'll keep this train rolling a bit. And also, we have a fairly sizable group, but feel free to, Heather and I are going to be monitoring the chat for questions. So if there's something that's not quite clear or you have a question, feel free, absolutely free to drop that in the chat so that we can keep this conversational and that we can make sure that you guys are getting what you need out of this hour that we have to spend together. And we know this is like a super busy time, right? You're back in your classroom. The last thing you want to do is listen to people talk. But we really appreciate you guys being here. And hopefully this is the start of a conversation that we can continue, as we learn together and get this new school year up and rolling. So thanks for being here. Use the chat as you wish. Here is our contact information. Again, this is the start of a conversation, hopefully. So Heather and I are here to answer any questions you have today. But as always, something, hopefully, like the teacher's dream is that if something we present today or something that we work on together today sparks an idea later, here's our email, and feel free to always, contact us because that's why we're here, to continue these kinds of learning opportunities well past the webinars. So there's our contact info. It's also on the Wayne Risa website if you go there and poke around a bit. So we're going to start with a little question about reading and science. So we'll do this, let's see, we'll do this waterfall style. So let's start with the first question. Put in a number into the chat. How important is it to learn to read? Statistically speaking, I think we're going to get a lot. We did this as a bell curve. Might not be a bell.
No, this is skewed.
Okay, so I think we all agree. You can kind of keep those. Let's move to the next question. This one is particularly interesting. Somebody who wears science on their sleeve or on their chest. So how important is reading to building science knowledge? Oh, thank you for putting Q2 in there. Okay, interesting trends.
Ooh,
Oh,
ooh. Do you see that too?
I see it too.
Mm.
All right, so on par, we're still, again, I'm not going to do the actual math here, but I'm saying we're going to average in the 4 and 5, up there near 4, somewhere between 4 and 5, even with that 2 in there. So reading is important. Learning how to read is important, and learning or being able to read is important into building science knowledge. Okay, so here's sort of the kicker question. When you think about elementary science instruction, how often is reading the primary mode? So you can just be honest, like how often is reading the primary mode that we expect kids to learn science? Much more variation in this last question. Okay. All right. So it's always interesting to start this session. We've done this session a couple times now, and the answers to those questions Some of them are predictable and some of them are kind of a little less predictable. And what we're going to show you guys today, or ask you guys to consider today, is some of the data that we have across Wayne County about reading and about science knowledge building. And we hope that both the data that we go over and then some of the, okay, what now conversations that we have will kind of help us guide to where we go next. All right, so Heather, you want to talk about the 4 parts?
Yes, sorry, I was dropping in links for those of us that are just joining. Yeah, so when we think about school in general and instruction in general, we really want to connect it back to this idea of coherence and having really 4 pieces to the puzzle of coherence. The first being assessment. You know, what does our local data, our statewide data tell us about science education, science instruction in those contexts, right? We also have a curricular resource piece of the puzzle. Really thinking about, you know, do we have curricular resources for science education? And what are the resources designed to do? And then we get to instructional practice as a piece of the puzzle. And this really gets at what are teachers and students doing? What are they saying? What are they reading about? What are they writing about? And then the last part is, last piece of the puzzle is connected to professional learning. So what sorts of professional learning opportunities are provided to our elementary K-5 spaces pertaining to science instruction, science education? And I'm going to add the word ongoing because we don't want one and done types of PD. We want ongoing learning so that we can connect new learning to our current practice. So this is the four parts of the puzzle that we're going to talk about today as it relates to science education. Ooh, all right, our current reality. So if you're following along in the slide deck, you're probably already clicking over into the next slide. But we have an interesting reality in the state of Michigan, but also locally in Wayne County.
Keep going.
There we go. Dun, dun, dun. The big reveal. All right, on the right of the slide, you can see the map of Michigan, and it is broken out into ISDs. And there is a link that will take you inside the slide deck that you can go into a data folder so you could actually see this in a much bigger view. But this is broken down into ISDs, and our ISD is the purple one over, below the thumb. We are the purple. And and this is all data, grade 5 science average for the county. And so what you'll find when you peruse that data set is that Wayne County ranks dead last in the state for proficiency on grade 5 science. On the left side, I like to live and work and tell data stories through infographics, and this is one of them. The first graph on top is contains all of the school districts and their percent proficient for grade 5 science. And then you have 2 bars. The green bar is the state average, and the blue bar, I know it's hard to see, that is our county average. And we have some districts that are above both state and county, and then we have some that are below both state and county, and some kind of hovering in the middle. The second graph is comparing percent proficient ELA grade 5 MSTEP to percent proficient science. I'm gonna ask the question, what do you notice? Maybe what are some wonderings that you have about either of the data sets? And let me see if I can grab that link for you, so if you want to look at it, pull up the data folder. What do you notice? What do you wonder?
Is it possible that you blow up the the data sets? It's kind of hard to read.
Yeah, so Heather's going to drop that in the link so you can do that. What we're hoping is that you guys just look at trends. So the individual numbers are not quite as important as what's the trend that you notice. All right, so Jennifer says ELA is always a higher percent. ELA always higher, always higher, always higher. Yeah. Anything else? Any other trends that you notice? Like, what about the districts across from, like, read from left to right? So we're noticing that there is definitely a pattern here, right? That there is a shape, a trend in the shape. And so one point that we like to make about this graph is, this science test is a reading test for sure, right? It's given on a computer and kids have to read not only the directions, but also the texts. They have to read the graphs, they have to read the diagrams. And so for sure, the science test is a reading test. But the other thing that we would like to point out here is that reading in and of itself is insufficient, right? So we want you to think about, like, at the end of the day, regardless of what test you're giving, education is really about building knowledge, right? Kids growing in their knowledge base so that they have access to more opportunities and more complex texts in a way, especially at the elementary level. And then the other piece that's really important to think about is that science is also something to be done. So participation in science there's also a skill set. Like, if you only know book science, but you're not aware of how science operates, then you're also not fully participating in science as an identity piece or as a member of a functioning community, right? And so that's the other thing, is that of course the science test is a reading test, but it's not sufficient to just focus on reading in order to raise both of these scores. So one of the questions that we would like to ask is, I wonder if more science content knowledge was baked into the day or baked into the year or the quarter, what impact would that have on our reading scores, right? How important is content knowledge? So just the questions kind of leave you thinking about that as we continue to move on. All right. Oops. Let me go to the next piece. All right. So here's some more data for you. And this one breaks my heart. I'll be honest, this one absolutely breaks my heart. So this is from a 2018 study of about 7,000 different teachers. This is a national survey of data. And so your mileage may vary, as they say, like depending on your context and your building and your schedule. But here's what it breaks down to. So 7,000 some odd teachers were interviewed around this, and here's the breakdown, right? So we have roughly 90 minutes a day for reading, roughly an hour for mathematics, and then somewhere around a half an hour for science, and somewhat slightly less than that for social studies, right? So again, the question that we tend to ask is, how is that working out? Right. So in what we just saw in terms of the science data is that it's not really working out all that well. If this is consistent across Wayne County, the learn to read, then read to learn sort of mentality, probably not really working for our kids, right? But we have to look. This is where it gets a little bit complicated. Well, if we want to change the outcomes, then some other structures are going to have to change. And remember, we having come out of the classroom, we understand the idea is there's just not enough time, right? There's never, ever enough time. But how we use the time, especially when it comes to science and social studies, content building or knowledge building, super important. So how are we going to use that time, right? Heather, can you help me out with this braided knowledge?
Yeah. One of the things that I'm gonna point out too, in the data, we saw some trends, right? Like ELA and science kind of mirrored one another, but oftentimes when we go into elementary schools and we talk to teachers about when they have time to teach science, they're like, well, it's if we get to it at the end of the day. You know, our literacy block takes up a lot of the time. So Rich and I often tend to ask questions like, well, if we're taking all this time in the day to devote to reading, like that specific content area, and science is pushed away, then why aren't our reading scores higher? It's a question we often ask. And so that's the question, you know, when we talk about this knowledge building, this joy of figuring things out, we really want to engage kids in that science. So many of you maybe are familiar with Scarboroughs Rope, which is that first graphic that you see on the screen. And this is where we have two parts of the rope that come together to create reading comprehension. So this rope recognizes that with the word reading, the actual reading of the words on the page means that kids have to have the letter sound knowledge, they have to be able to decode words, and they have to have some automaticity in that decoding. And on the other side of the rope, we have this language comprehension. And this means that kids can understand sentences. This is where they start to make inferences. We're monitoring comprehension. We can understand different text structures between, like, you know, fiction and nonfiction. And we understand word meanings. And both of these pieces of the rope must come together in order for reading comprehension to happen. But what often happens inside of classrooms is that we have this overemphasis on these foundational skills, right? And this can be problematic, especially when we're trying to build that background knowledge and build vocabulary with our students, which is part of that language comprehension side of the rope. So it's crucial that we are doing due diligence, that we have both sides of the rope that are working in our literacy blocks. On the science rope side, so science has a rope as well, and their rope is really about it's three-dimensional. So Rich is going to talk a little bit later about like what three-dimensional science means, but it really means that we're pulling together three pieces of science to create these performance expectations. And likely, like my science experience in school was all centered around the disciplinary core ideas. You're going to read in the book, you're going to look up some vocabulary around a plant, and that's going to, and then you may draw a diagram, and then you're going to move on. I wasn't really engaged in science. So my experience with science was only in the disciplinary core ideas, like your textbook stuff. But there's also these other ideas, these cross-cutting concepts in the science and engineering practices that also have to be woven in order for us to have three-dimensional science.
Yeah, and I'll just add on a little bit to that to say that my favorite science lessons, when I look at curricular resources or materials, the four things that pop into my head are, what are the kids doing? What are the kids talking about? And then what are they reading and writing about? And if we're true to this sort of like education world, then they should be doing that in the context. Like science is a great context for developing literacy, authentic literacy practices. So yeah, we're going to continue to look at curricular resources and what are kids actually doing, right? Do they get a chance to engage in inquiry, to investigate things that lead them towards more complex versions of literacy versus just reading the chapter? All right, so more on that later, but keep that in mind, right? Like science is a great context in order to build some of these literacy pieces together. So I was actually in a workshop a couple weeks ago at Martin Luther King Junior High School in Detroit, and this top phrase was up on the wall in the cafeteria space: intelligence plus character. That is the goal of true education. And as as you're sitting in this space and looking at those words, I really thought deeply about what does that mean for science education, right? Like intelligence and character. I want all of my science learners to embody those pieces as well, right? Because science should be used for good and to improve this world that we live in. But how does that work in a classroom setting? And this is how I translated that. So I believe in sort of building on that rope, or maybe tying those two ropes, the literacy and the science rope, together. It's building science knowledge, but also knowing and participating in how science works, right? So these two documents, if you click on that link, how science works, goes directly to the 3 dimensions of science and nature of science and how science works. Because if you know how science works, then you can participate in it. And you're not just sort of resigned to consuming what other people tell you the truth might be, or what the facts might be. You can investigate them for yourselves. And because the nature of science is, I'm a child of the 80s, right? Imagine how much science has discovered and learned since I was in school in the 80s. It's amazing. It's a ton. And the textbook is going to keep changing, right? So if I only concentrate on the knowledge side, then I'm never going to keep up, right? That's the nature of things, right? But if I'm also engaged in the practices of science and I have the sort of the rules, the skills to participate in science, whether I become a STEM, professional, or whether I'm just a citizen who believes that our water should be clean, right? Then I can participate in that. I can be an active member of the science community, because that's good for everybody, right? So I just want to throw that out there as I guess just a call to like everybody. I'll say one more thing, I guess, about that. The last couple of years have taught us, if they've taught us anything, it's that we really don't have a choice to be science literate. You just don't have a choice anymore. There was a time perhaps where science was, just for this people or just for doctors and things like that. We don't have any choice anymore. Everybody really needs to be science literate in this way. And so here's the standards, right?
Can we go back to that
Sure.
really quickly?
Yeah.
If you do pull up these matrices and take a perusal through them and read through about science, what you won't find anywhere in this document are the words read. There's nothing about read this chapter, read this book. It's all about how kids and students engage in science. So something that I thought was really interesting when I did my own reading of it, and I just did a control find just to see and make sure I didn't miss anything, but it is nowhere on this document.
Interesting. So it's like, you do need to read, but that's not all. You need a lot more than that. Yeah. So well said. Thank you for adding that bit. Yeah. So again, we know that there's not enough time in the day. We know that schedules are built for math and ELA, right? Like, and we know why, right? That No Child Left Behind started us down this road, and we're not going to like turn back the clock on that. But we know that those are the accountability measures, and so that's kind of how the systems are built. But what we also would like to argue is, again, that science and literacy go together so nicely and build together in a complementary way, that it doesn't have to be either or. And so a couple years ago, the science ed community and some literacy folks that some names that you might be familiar with, like Nell Duke and like Tanya Wright from Michigan and from MSU, Gina Cervetti as well, got together and produced a white paper. Is that the right term? A guidance document about why it's important to support literacy through the science lens. And you can like put a slash on there that social studies is just as important. In fact, I would argue when you look at the early elementary science and social studies standards themselves, there's a whole bunch of crossover. There really is just a lot of place where science and social studies kind of, meet in the Venn diagram of things. But that all that to say is, even the literacy experts would agree that building science knowledge is a net gain for literacy, and that's what this document kind of says.
And one of the things that you may be thinking about, like, well, my curricular resource that I use for literacy connects with science standards. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a little bit, but we can't cover all of the language arts standards just through literacy alone. We have to engage in other disciplines in order to really see the breadth and depth of those content standards in action. One of the things that in different groups that I'm a part of, we talk a lot about like prior knowledge and background knowledge and vocabulary building. And all of those things are acquired through the learning in other content areas, through the learning of history, through investigations, through asking questions and being curious. All of those things help to build student content knowledge, student background knowledge, and vocabulary.
Yeah, so that's one of those things that we would really love for you to take back that document, investigate that document as in a PLC or with some of your colleagues, and interrogate it just like we would ask kids to interrogate text. I would love for you to interrogate that text and see what it means in terms of your present situation and sort of where we want to be moving forward, right, in terms of the connections between science and literacy. Just a quick reminder for those who join us, feel free to drop questions in the chat or anything like that, or comments even if you'd like, because we'll respond to those as well as we can. All right, Heather, a little more data for us.
Yeah. So I took the data from Wayne County, and I actually looked at by building, or not by building, by district. And this actually included all of our districts in Wayne County. The infographic wasn't big enough to include all of them, but this includes all of our public school districts and public school academies. And I compared economically disadvantaged, so your free reduced lunch, with performance on grade 5 MSTEP. One of the things that we don't want to have happen is that free and reduced lunch dictates how students score, right? We don't want poverty levels to dictate how kids are going to perform on a test, right? So we have to actively work to disrupt those predictors in ways that support student learning. So as you can see, we have some buildings, some districts in our county that are disrupting that predictor of free and reduced lunch and poverty and how students perform on a test. So the little dots indicate districts, and as you can see, we have a couple districts that are outperforming the state and the county and have high levels of free and reduced lunch. And so the question is, what are they doing?
What are they doing?
What are they doing?
Yeah. So this part, yeah, is sort of like investigating what are they doing. And so the short answer I can tell you for sure is those folks above the line, those folks above the line, what this, like, one way to read this graph is that it's definitely an opportunity gap graph rather than an ability graph or anything else. Yeah, these are all Wayne County districts. So, and which ones doesn't really matter so much, but the idea is for every district, looking at your data and then looking at the opportunities that kids have to develop background knowledge in science and to develop skill sets in participatory science, those are going to be the differences on the M-STEP. Because yes, the M-STEP is a reading test, but it's also almost entirely an application test. It is not based on, strictly on vocabulary. There are no questions on the M-STEP anymore about name the parts of the plant. Not a question. Right? On the question would be more like, okay, here are the parts of the plant. Which parts do which? Apply. If this part of the plant were to disappear, what functions would the plant not be able to do? Completely different type of application level questions, and that's what we're that's what we would like you to take away from this graph. Okay, so Jennifer said, are you talking to those districts about what they are doing? Yeah, I think, Jennifer, we do have a pretty good idea. And that's why I'm saying, like, it's an opportunity gap. So one thing that we look at is the schedule, right? Are kids actually engaging in regular science learning? Not only, from a reading standpoint, right? But across the board, like, do they have a well-rounded whole child engagement in multiple modes of learning and building science knowledge? Do they have opportunities to apply what they're learning? Those things we can say for sure are in it, right? And to be honest, like, yes, that does require a pretty good audit of your materials. On the one end, what we can say for absolute sure is if anybody in any district at any level says we cover the science in our reading program, they are 100% wrong. Like, that is absolutely not going to work, and it doesn't work, and we know that for an actual fact. So, what should we be doing in terms of schedule? What should we be doing in terms of materials? We can support, we can definitely help in those areas, do some auditing, make some recommendations to districts or to curricular committees. And that's something that Heather and I have done in a number of different districts over the past year, as we've taken this data out to committees, to PLCs and leadership teams. So great question, Jennifer. And yeah, that's probably outside, like, actually getting into what materials we would suggest or how to structure a day, outside the scope of this particular webinar. But we're happy to reconnect on that question and dig deeper into it with any school or district in our county. Okay. So, and here's, this is just a takeaway activity. This is one of the activities that we do when we do go into schools. We probably don't have time, and it's a little awkward to do this online. We've never done it online, and I think it wouldn't work very well. But here's the basic idea. And again, you can take this back to your PLC. And if you want to engage in this kind of discussion, here are all the materials. It's pretty straightforward. So we have 3 different resources here listed, all of which are in use somewhere in Wayne County, right? So one is Mystery Science. A lot of folks are familiar with Mystery Doug. Became very popular, especially going into the pandemic when a lot of stuff went online, because it's a pretty low bar in terms of use, right? Very high usability in terms of materials. And then we also have actually one of the reading programs that's in use across the county, and that's the EL program, and also purports to do both science, social studies, and reading all together. right? So if you're familiar with that, there's another one that, and the last one is a product which is now commercially available, but also an OER from our friends at Michigan State University, Create for STEM. They are curriculum developers with a lot of experience. And so that MLPBL is called Multiple Literacies. It is both a reading and a science program combined, but also the structure of it is project-based learning. And so one way to look at how these different materials or what these materials ask kids to do or what they're really designed for is to look at their assessments, right? Backwards design, look at the end in mind, and that'll give you a clue about what kinds of things kids are asked to do in terms of instruction and learning. So we've got those linked here. And the way to look at that is using this rubric. Right. And so this is let's see who put this. This was put together from the writers of the NGSS standards in Achieve, and it's called a tasks pre-screener. It's a way to evaluate what an assessment is actually testing. And the idea here is to identify red flags and eliminate as many as possible. So the M step, for example, all the items on the M step go through a screener similar to this. And that's a way, and if we're gonna use that data on the M step to inform instruction in some way, and Heather and I would both agree that, you know, a one-time test is insufficient data as well, right? So we don't put all of our eggs into the M step basket, so to speak, but it's important, right? It's a data point for us to look at. And so we can look at our assessments that we're giving throughout the year or from our curricular materials and see, all right, how well do these align with what they're going to see at the end? And does that matter, right? And how do we use that local data that's much more frequent, right? If we're saying, you know, especially in 5th grade, right? So by the time they go from 3rd to 4th to 5th, and now we're asking them to take a test in 5th grade, for sure, our local assessments in those grade bands ought to be in line to give our kids in 5th grade the best chance that they can. So here's the rubric, right? One thing you'll notice is that it should be application-based. So there has to be a phenomenon or a driving problem in the task. And the second question in there is important as well, is like the kids have to use their literacy skills and their science knowledge in order to answer the questions. So beyond rote memorization, a really good task should ask kids to apply literacy and science knowledge all together, right? So that's just a screener that we use. And you can use this with your own test, quiz, assessment, performance. Like, really encourage you to take your first unit and look at the assessments in that unit and see like how much of this is in there, because that's what we're asking kids to do at the end, right?
Rich, so
yeah,
can you just talk about we did the session I would say a couple months ago, and yes, we'll drop the link to the screener in the chat.
yeah.
But we had somebody who was using the mystery science, and how disappointed she was when she gave that final assessment.
Yeah. So, yeah, kind of going back to this, right? So that's why looking at the assessments is really important. So what this teacher was kind of sharing with us is that the kids are super engaged. She enjoyed teaching using the materials, but every single time they got to the unit assessment and the kids were asked to do knowledge transfer, they really, really struggled, right? And so that's a really good data point for all of us, right? Like that, I think every teacher has given that test or that assessment, and the kids have bombed it, and you're like, oh, but wait, I really thought I was doing the thing. What happened? And there's a lot of reasons for it. But one thing you can look at is again, like, okay, how many opportunities throughout instruction did the kids have to develop that particular skill or piece of knowledge that you asked them to apply on that assessment. And in this case, it was really eye-opening for her to think about that screener and say, oh, yeah, we were doing a lot of activity, but we weren't really reflecting on knowledge building so much. So it was more in the, so you know, I think that was a really nice moment for both of us, both Heather and myself and this teacher to get into that conversation and go, yeah. So the class was well organized, the kids were engaged and happy, but learning wasn't happening the way that we wanted it to. And so now what? Right? Now what is always the question. And that's, I think that's a perfectly fine place to start, right? So that's why I love this activity, and hope that you guys will take it and use it. Yeah, and if you have any questions about when you look at the screener and you go, I don't understand what that means, absolutely give us a call. We'll walk you through it. So in person, the way we do this is we do a jigsaw. So one group gets the EL, they look at the performance assessment. And so here you can kind of see what that looks like, right? And so it's called a performance task. And you can see in the directions here, the kids say, cut out the trading card, fold in half along the dotted line, stick it to the front and back of the trading card. And so that is the task. The kids are creating their own info card about the different, I guess, in this case, frogs. Okay. And that's also linked down there to the performance task that they would see on the same content on the M step. So you can kind of compare those two things, right? Here's the mystery science. A full year for grade 3, same kind of thing, right? So we got animals through time would be that same content area. And there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 8 mystery science activities about that. And that's probably really hard to read, but you can just kind of peruse, right? Here are the types of questions that are on the mystery science assessment, right? So vervet monkeys are herbivores, omnivores, carnivores, right? And then here is the MLPBL structure. This particular unit is also in that ecosystems, animals topic bundle. And this one happens to be what birds do we see around our school and how do they look? And again, this is going to be a little bit hard to read. Apologize, but trust me, it's much better to do it in person when you get to kind of dig into this. So here's the driving question. How do we help birds around our school grow and survive? It's a big question. Okay. And then back to data. So I'm gonna pass it back to Heather.
So we have another white paper to share with you around how project-based learning experiences can actually support both science and literacy. And the graph is just a beautiful depiction of reading levels, baseline reading levels, for those that were in the control group and for those that were in the treatment group that actually had the project-based learning experience connected with science. And as you can see, kids are still growing, they're still growing in their reading, but in the inclusion of the project-based infusion connection with science actually really had a strong impact on literacy scores, is really exciting to see. So if you go this route, you're not going to go wrong, is basically what that data is telling us. But I'll drop that link in the chat for you, because this is this work, this project-based supports kids engaging in science. It supports building of knowledge. It supports kids being curious, which is all things that we want to see for our students.
Yeah, I particularly like the title of this white paper. This is came as one of the efficacy studies that was done using that project-based learning modality. And what we're showing or what this study shows is that at every single reading level, kids built background knowledge, right? And so if we claim that background knowledge is critical to ongoing literacy development, then this shows that that's happening, right? The other important thing that we don't have a graph for just for in terms of space, but is that kids also reported social emotional development during project-based learning in science. And that's another thing that we say, especially, recently, SEL has been a huge topic, right? One of the questions that we ask based on this research is, does it have to be an add-on, or can we use science to build in SEL? Because I guarantee, like when Heather and I start arguing about data, and we do so in a positive way, and we're going back and forth and chatting, that's part of the socialization that science provides a context for. So we would, highly encourage you guys to take a look at that report and dig into it. So that's the story. Looking at data, seeing what it means, looking for opportunities to link science and literacy together in a really authentic way. And then also, let's look at your materials and look at the opportunities that kids have in terms of science, and making science a context for building on their literacy skills. That's the takeaway that we hope you guys have. And again, on behalf of Wayne Risa, my friend Heather, thank you guys so much for being here. Have a wonderful start to your school year. And keep teaching science.
Keep teaching science.
Keep
Thank
teaching.
you, everyone.
Thank you all.